We're on. We're on
We're on the
again.
stream. I have a note. The stream is live.
The stream is indeed live.
Yeah.
I had a successful run of camembert cheese.
You sent me a photo, which I unfortunately in my haste to get out the menu, I forgot to put that photo into our post, so our esteemed listener and viewership cannot enjoy the visual deliciousness of that cheese. How did it come out?
It was absolutely spectacular, if I may say so myself.
You may say so yourself.
I will say so. It was absolutely spectacular. I mean, I think that there's no way to describe the satisfaction of producing something that seems to be so intricate and so technical, and that, in my mind, in any way, entails the wisdom of very, very ancient, very long-bearded French cheesemakers hanging out in caves with their dogs and long sort of staffs, and just kind of getting out of your fridge and seeing it evolve over days. I mean, it's just, there is a labor of love element to it, but I think that there is also a kind of crazy science experiment, as we used to do when we were children. So it was just spectacular, and it tastes amazing. So anyway, I encourage everybody listening to us to actually get into cheese making, which for me goes with yogurt making, beer making. I'm doing a lot of those things. I think for me, certain sort of hands-on kind of activities.
Wonderful. Yeah, I me and my fermentations. I mean, last night when I've been on the road traversing the Schland for the last few weeks, enjoying all the many gifts that German culture in all of its forms has to give us. So I was very happy to be home last night, to be cooking for myself and cooking in my kitchen with the food I like to eat, and made use of all those weeks I was away. And some weeks before that, I've been fermenting lemons. And I threw some lemons into the broccoli that I made, and it was spectacular.
I think it's really just there is thing has happened. Obviously, I mean, I think we're just really one of trend. I mean, what we've seen ourselves is part of a very broad trend of returning to, I mean, from our parents' days of sort of everything would be acquired in the supermarket.
Yeah.
To actually having this kind of I blame a lot of the movie, iPhone, this, that. I mean, all of a sudden, actually producing these things ourselves in our kitchens and our yards. And I think we are rediscovering, I think, the joys and the satisfaction and the tribulations of that, obviously, as well, because things go bad.
Except you and I are doing it wrong, because we're not putting our results on Instagram. At least I'm not.
True. I'm certainly not. I mean, every once in a while, I remember I have an Instagram account and I just plug in the stuff. But I think it's for me, it's a much more private pleasure. I mean, for me, it has a lot less to do with really, exhibiting the product of my work, is with the sheer kind of magic of seeing these things like pop up on my table, right? Or like emerge from my fridge, or like my garden, which you can kind of see here directly. I mean, you're seeing a fig actually, and
Yeah.
It gives, and there is something really just breathtaking about these processes, kind of, especially when you get older. I think that time slows down, or maybe it speeds up actually. I mean, we get older and time speeds up. We get older quicker, and you will see these things that as a kid for me used to take forever, and you just wanted to be there already. And now it's sort of, there is all these observational vintage points in between where I see like the bud and it's turning. So I enjoy that greatly, and I have the intuition that a lot of people are sort of going down that road as well. Anyway,
yeah, I mean, it touches. We talked about it. We talked a little bit about last week, the cyclical nature of things. Things fall out of fashion, then come back into fashion, and then reactions to those reactions. So we're definitely in some area of that cycle when it comes to very much hands-on making of things.
And we're part of the larger family of people rediscovering that, right? I mean,
yeah. So
anyhow, where do we start this week?
Well, I think we start I think we start in Spain, right? We got
Okay.
two stories out of Spain. You know, so we have a Spanish story out of Spain, and we have, of course, a European story out of Spain. All
Indeed.
all the leaders of the EU have at an informal meeting. I'm not quite sure what the difference between a formal and an informal meeting is when heads of state meet, but nonetheless, I'm sure there's some codified difference there. Having our informal meeting. Well, this was, I guess, not just the EU, but the European community, political community,
Indeed.
which is one of these. I guess it's the outermost concentric circle of how the EU likes to view itself, shaping the world. Sort of the EU plus its like-minded members.
Very, very much so. So I mean,
or
I think that
wannabe members, I guess. Those who will never
Right.
really make the cut to be at the cool kids table, but they're allowed to sit just at the table next to the cool kids.
Next to it, exactly. And it's sort of, if you come to a party at Granada, you can actually join the bar for maybe a couple of hours. So yes, the future of strategic autonomy, which is a term that was concocted when Trump came to power, because the Europeans figured out that the Americans were completely unreliable, has been sort of kind of dormant during the Biden few years, in which the Europeans thought that they could rely on the US again. We will get to why they just discovered that they cannot yet again. And this had a lot to do with the position of Europe geostrategically and the way in which, beyond the European Union institutions itself, Europe had to think about the way in which it positioned itself. So obviously the Ukraine situation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, brought that once again to the very fore. And I think that once again, Europeans thought, kind of thank God that this happened during a Biden administration. Had this happened during the Trump administration, we would probably have the Russians marching right now into Berlin or maybe even Paris. So they actually convened now in Granada, I would say, in Spain, and they brought Zelensky for the ride to discuss essentially.
Well, he shows up at every party. He's the special guest at every cool kids party.
Pretty much. He was last week in Canada, as you probably have seen, and now he was in Spain. And nothing has so far come out of that, and I don't really expect anything to come out of that, at least publicly. I think that most of it were expressions of goodwill and sympathy and tea and cookies. But it is nonetheless.
I like tea and cookies. I mean,
I do too. But
it's not nothing.
Unlike our Green Minister of Agriculture, Chemos Demir, who has claimed that he's a green, and he had claimed about a year ago that not eating meat would be a strong contribution against the Russian effort in Ukraine, I tend to think that tea and cookies are politically insufficient, much like thoughts and prayers. Not to mention thoughts and prayers about like teas and cookies. Those are things that have absolutely no place.
What if I'm thinking and praying? What if I'm thinking and praying while eating tea and cookies? That must have some kind of double effect.
Actually, we could think about that. Maybe in the next episode, we can have something like that. But I mean, so I think that the point here is that the pile of good intentions into which like a lot of these things get put on, and then they get sort of dusted out and put back on display because there is some sort of sudden emergency or sudden sense that something has gone off. Essentially, it's also a way to mark the lack of political initiative or policy initiatives in the intervening years. So anyway, they're now in Granada, and a lot of the conversation, I think it's going to be, I mean, it's been for the last couple of days, and I think it's came to an end, if I'm not mistaken, yesterday or today. The end of this essentially will be, I think, much more willing and dealing in the background as to, who gets what and what happens, for instance, with situations now, which we'll get to probably in a few minutes. But Fico, who just won in Slovakia, and, people that are kind of not supportive of Ukraine and are redrawing a little bit the position of Europe in relation to, this kind of conflict. The other story out of the thing, sorry, go on, I guess.
No, I was going to say the strategic autonomy is such an interesting, or such a perfect example of sort of the lack of meaning within the strength of institutions, even when they lack any meaning or substance.
Yeah,
Because
sure.
the EU as a body it's such a fact on the ground, right? There's no shaking or moving the EU. Even when there's so many open questions about what the EU actually is, what its policies are, both within itself and the EU relation with the world. And it takes so long for the European Union to decide on anything and to move forward with policy. And we look at the Green Deal, it's taken or it's taken years. We look at all the tech regulations, taken almost a decade. Then this idea of strategic autonomy. Can anyone even really explain what strategic autonomy?
If I can interrupt you, I mean, very quickly, not only those things which are kind of glacial problems that people see as sort of, very hidden and we have time, but there are things like, the Ukrainian war. And as I talk to like most of my contacts in sorry, I have a visitor suddenly here.
Wonderful.
Most of my contacts in Brussels, one of the things that is remarkable is that everybody who was really at the center of the thing as sort of at the decision-making level, like right around the time that the war started, they were telling you 6 months later that had the Americans not been there pushing, that the Europeans would still be completely stopped. I'm trying to, as you can see, I'm trying to woo people away, but it's not really quite working.
So people want to be part of Euroscopic.
Right. People want to be part of Euroscopic. I don't know. There is a bit of a war going there. So, I mean, I think that the point that is important to remember is that it's not really just in sort of very large issues that seem to have very little moving sort of, parts when you actually look at the day-to-day. I mean, things that are urgent, like an invasion of Russia into European sort of not EU, but European territory, still takes the Europeans like ages to actually resolve and ages to address.
Right. And of course, partly that's because you need the unanimous agreement of all 27 member states for big decisions, especially foreign policy decisions. So it's understandable that things take time. It's understandable that member states have their own domestic political and policy concerns. And that's actually one of the issues is does the EU switch from a unanimous system to a qualified majority system? There are pretty decent pros and cons for both of those things. The biggest pro, of course, is that countries like Poland and Hungary can no longer hold the EU hostage for things that they need to move forward on, especially things on rule of law and these sort of the basket of so-called democratic values and support for Ukraine, resistance to Russia, this sort of stuff. But of course, there is also a danger to moving too quickly and things falling apart if you don't have the consensus and the agreement of most, if not all, of your members. You could lead to a breakdown of the system overall. So that's a big sticking point. Just forget about the policies before we even get to the policies. There's glacial movement on how do we decide about the policies. Right. And so I think beyond whatever substance there is to this idea of European sovereignty, Macron's wonderful idea, it's just it's a symbolic example of how glacially things move far too slowly for keeping up with world events. I mean, this idea of sovereignty came, as you said, during the Trump era, also during this era of so-called another Macron statement, the brain dead NATO, when he gave that famous interview to The Economist. And okay, so we've thrown this term out into the world. We now have this idea of sovereignty. No one's really quite defined it. While we're busy trying to figure out what this is, how it's defined, what it would look like, what it would mean, world events are going at their own pace. Trump is out, Biden is in, the Russians are in Ukraine. Now we're getting to the end of Biden's first term. Trump might be back. So the world is moving both forward. I guess it's like slinky policies. It's moving both simultaneously forward and in sort of a cyclical fashion. So it's kind of like a slinky, the way the kind of human events move forward. Yeah. But so the world is moving like a slinky, but these ideas, these policy initiatives are moving just in a circle, if they're moving at all. And you end up with just these empty slogans that no one can quite understand what they mean. And even once you've decided what they mean, it doesn't matter anymore because the thing that they were meant to address has already changed. I think that's a fundamental problem with the European Union, fundamental challenge, which of course is not lost on European Union officials themselves. And it's what we're seeing in Granada right now, happening in this informal meeting, not only with European Union leaders, but as we said, the European political community, which involves like North African countries. I think even Canada is part of the European political community. It's kind of like Eurovision for politics.
I mean, it is, in a way, it's Eurovision for politics. I think that one needs to remember that, democracy is inherently unstable. People like to say that, tyrannies are unstable. Tyrannies are not unstable. I mean, tyrannies actually can last very, very long periods of time. I mean, take a look at Russia, take a look at Belarusia, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that what that means is also that strategic autonomy in a place where you actually have so many actors pulling in so many different directions, essentially is a non-starter. You can have sovereignty for a unit, but you cannot really have a sovereignty of essentially, I mean, this kind of very, uneven grouping. The problem is, the added problem here is that you have a lot of actors that have very, very unclear loyalties. So, I mean, somebody like Fico now in Slovakia, or somebody like Meloni, who has had so many years of cozy relations with Russia, somebody like Le Pen, who has actually taken money from Russia, or people like the right wing of Germany that has such a strange relation with the Trumpian project. So, I mean, I think that all of these things actually mean that the question of autonomy in Europe is actually a very, very elusive one. We should move to the next story in Spain, which is that after the foretold failure of the right, the center right with the far right in coalition to actually form a government in Spain. Now the king has asked the sitting transitional president, who happens to be also the former president, so the same guy doing the same job, and there are two different titles, to actually form government. And he has pinned the very possibility, or it has been pinned for him actually, on an amnesty for all the Catalonians that had actually gone crazy a couple of years ago, declared more or less an independent, a vote for independence, had called people to the ballots, and had produced sort of, I think, one of the most violent episodes that we've seen politically, that we've seen in Spain in many, many years. So these people, many of whom are in jail, many of whom are now in exile, Puigdemont famously in Brussels, are demanding essentially an amnesty to return, which is I think it might be one of the most spectacular political victories and upsets and plot twists that I have ever seen, most certainly in European politics. But altogether, it's just remarkable to see these people that were pariahs until only a couple of days ago, all of a sudden essentially being at the very top of the political pyramid.
Speaking of cyclical, right? Speaking of cyclical, this is like cyclical pure here.
Yeah.
These completely persona. I mean, there was the manhunt that happened in the European Union years ago, and now the man hunted, the fugitive, is now the king.
Coming down, it's hunting. The man hunted is coming back to hunt not only Spain, because the fact is that this guy now is quite literally the kingmaker or the president maker in Spain. In fact, I would say that the king has called on Sanchez to form government only because the true kingmaker is Puigdemont. But I think that the most important thing is that they actually now have a massive hand on essentially reshaping European politics, because obviously, now they are in a position to actually define sort of a lot of policy that will ultimately also impact the European Union, including.
Would you say it's a fair, if I were to boil down these insane developments into maybe an oversimplification, but would you say it's fair to say Spain is faced essentially with two bad choices? One is to go with the socialists, but that would come at the potential medium to longer term instability if it breathes new life into the separatist movement, or the center right with the help of the far right.
Look, I am of the somewhat unpopular opinion that the failure of Catalonia is the failure of absolute boorish stupidity I don't know if those words need each other. Perhaps it's a redundance, but boorish stupidity. Let me just imbecility, really, consistent, long term, and committed of the different governments that have actually gone through Madrid, particularly the center right, which essentially has what I think is a very Spanish disposition of it is what we say. It comes to all empires, I think. You see this a bit in Russia now. You see the American states. What we say is law. I mean, there was this way to use the statement, the term, rule of law, in which rule of law for Spain during the Catalonian crisis meant whatever Madrid says is law. Whereas, as a matter of fact, I mean, rule of law means that the law has preeminence over what like the Madrid powers say at any given time. So there was a lot of browbeating. There was a lot of money that was taken from Catalonia, not given back. Catalonia, keep in mind, that was actually one of the main political and economic motors of Spain. So they actually brought it on themselves, and they actually trumped up the charges against many of these people, sent them running, jailed people for a long period of times with no sentence, no fixed sentence. So in some sense, I think that this is rather, from my point of view, and I am an anti-nationalist that does not have 3 seconds for national claims, but I think that this really is poetic justice. And
it is, yeah. But maybe at the cost of all of us.
Well, to some degree, this will create political stability, but it might also force the Union to finally push into negotiating with the autonomous regions. I think that the point here, the main point to be made, is that there are aspirations that need to be avowed to, and at least need to be listened to. So I think that this really is poetic justice, and I don't think that it could have happened to more deserving people than sort of the center right flirting with essentially neo-fascists. I mean, I think that they deserved every single bit of it, if you ask me. Anyhow,
right. Well,
we move to Germany. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No. We can always move to Germany. There's always something to talk about in Germany. It usually puts people to sleep, but we can try to find a different tact.
Oh, but this week we have actually a far-right politician that apparently was attacked with a syringe and perhaps poisoned.
So says the AfD. I mean, it's an insane story. I mean, head of the national head of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, Tina Trapula, apparently collapses or something happened.
Would you put it? Crapula, but it's actually Krapala.
Yeah, well, something happens to him at a campaign event in Bavaria, which is having elections this weekend. Rushed to the hospital. Rumors of him being attacked or poisoned or stabbed with a needle, or no one really knows. He went to the hospital. His blood work came back negative for any kind of poison. The AfD is running with all kinds of rumors and conjecture, heavily criticized by the interior minister of Bavaria, who's on the center right himself. He's conservative himself, but criticizing his friends to the further right, saying that they're acting completely irresponsible in sort of fanning rumors and gossip about what may or may not have happened. Still, no one knows. The party leader, Tino, is now gone. He's out of the hospital. We still don't know what's happening. The police are investigating. Police are saying nothing. The AfD is not really to be trusted. The media is just going on crumbs that it can find. No one really knows what happens, but maybe he just had a bout of flu. I mean, we have no idea. Nonetheless, it's coming on the heels of obviously a surging far right, not so much in Bavaria. They have their own sort of alternative far right politics to deal with, but not the AfD in name. But it's coming at a time of surging popularity, at least in the polls, for the AfD, and on top of 2 heavily watched state elections in Germany. So it's just one more little twist as we round the final bend to elections on Sunday.
I wanted to ask you about that, but first I just wanted to remind you that only a couple of weeks ago, the co-chair of the party, Ms. Alice Weidel, who is a far-right lesbian with children who doesn't live in Germany but in Switzerland. I love it because, I mean, this is somebody that sort of thoroughly has enjoyed the fruits of progressive politics, right? I mean, in her personal life, it's essentially a song, it's an ode to progressive politics and the possibilities of progressive politics. Nonetheless, she was supposedly taken into shelter. She was given shelter by the Swiss police because there was supposedly a threat on her life. And then she gave apparently some sort of party speech, stomping speech, which she did online because the FD claimed that she was still in danger. Turns out that somebody spotted her that very day in Mallorca, hanging out with her wife and the kids. So, they are really not to be trusted. And there is something very, very strange about this sort of ongoing made up shit, really. I mean, just, made up stuff going, which makes obviously the story of Hrupala rather curious and unlikely. But I think that what you do have here, which I think that it's making all Germans of other party extractions very nervous, is that there is this smell of, let's say, a Reichstag fire kind of thing.
I don't think we're quite there yet, but yeah, there are, this kind of, this doublespeak that's going on.
Well, I mean, so what I mean to say by that, I mean, maybe before we get the lawsuit, we should actually clarify that, is that there is sort of a present and clear and present danger that the far right is now sort of pointing to, that comes down to the personal safety of its politicians. And it's actually mobilizing, the security of the state insofar as they can, like involving the police and their investigations. And they're sort of under the thought or under the accusation, implicit, obviously, because nobody's saying, the AfD is not saying exactly who these people are that are attacking them, of being essentially, in harm's way, political harm's way.
Right. I mean, fortunately, they don't have, unlike the actual Reichstag fire, they don't have the power to then, mete out consequences like banning all other democratically elected parties and taking over the state. Not yet, anyway. But that is what is making people watch extra closely these state elections. Not specifically so much Bavaria and Hessen, where, well, Hessen is a different story, but it's generally this upcoming cycle of state elections.
Right. Can you talk a bit about it? What is about to happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, so as we know, Germany is a federal system. It's decentralized. So as difficult as it is to get excited about state elections, sometimes for states that people outside of Germany have never even heard of, they do actually exercise a lot of power at the federal level, given the decentralized makeup and structure of Germany. So these states so when there is a state election, Germany looks at them very closely. They're seen as a bellwether for how people feel about whatever government is in power at the federal level. In Bavaria and Hessen, we have state elections happening on Sunday. Today is Saturday, as we're recording this. Bavaria, and both states, we pretty much know, barring some major surprise, what's going to happen. Of course, the Christian Social Union in Bavaria has had a lock on that state essentially since the end of World War II. For a long time, eventually they were able to rule for a very, very long time, up until just the last election cycle, on their own, which is unheard of in Germany, to not need a coalition partner. But even the great and mighty CSU have suffered from this breakup of big tent parties and this shift we're seeing in politics right now, and did have to go into coalition with the Free Voters, which is a conservative populist party that is flirts with some far right ideas. Of course, we discussed in a previous episode a bit of a so-called anti-Semitism scandal with the leader of the Free Voters, the Freie Wähler, in Bavaria. Anyway, those two parties look to be on track to continue their coalition after elections. And it's not such a surprise to say that the Social Democrats, the SPD, the Greens, who are in power at the federal level, it's not such a surprise that they're so weak in Bavaria, outside of some very small urban centers like the center of Munich. Hessen, we have a center-right party and the CDU, and the Greens in power there, and they look like they're going to continue their coalition as well. So both states continuing their coalitions. So the actual outcome is not going to be such a surprise. But the question is, especially in Hessen, which is in West Germany, or Western Germany, I should say,
and a very rich state.
Both of these states are very rich. So the 2 points about Hessen is, one, by Western German standards, it has pretty strong far-right affiliations. The AfD could do very well. It probably won't come anywhere close to having any chance of needing to be thwarted from government. But they could do very well. They could even do better than the Social Democrats, the SPD. Of course, a formerly Big Ten party and in power, running Germany right now under Olaf Scholz.
Worth saying that is a trend that has been seen across Germany,
right,
especially on the east, right? I mean, them climbing.
Right. So we've seen this in the east, in the eastern states, where the AfD really are going to give other parties a run for their money when they have their state elections next year, and are presenting some big challenges to how do you protect democracy, so to speak, or democratic electoral politics, and keep the AfD out if the AfD wins a democratic election. Hessen is sort of an outlier where there is strong AfD support, not as strong as in the East, and have had some serious scandals of police and law enforcement and security personnel being tied to the far right, not necessarily AfD, but other elements in the far right. So there's been some major scandals over the last couple of years in Hessen between data leaks to the far right of human rights organizations and activist leaders, protecting minorities and these kinds of things. So how well the AfD will do in Hessen. And then for the SPD, their top woman running to be, to unseat the CDU is the interior minister at the federal level, Nancy Faeser. So the question is, if she performs as poorly as the polls are showing, does she have a career and a future at the federal level like she would like to have? It's no surprise, I don't think, that she has left and right in the last few weeks been banning, as she's allowed to as the interior minister for the country, she's been banning left and right various far-right parties and groupings and extremist groups, which is, she has the right to do it, and she probably has a good sound legal case to do it. But it's clearly part of politics in her campaign to show that she is strong against extremist movements, making a statement in her claim for power in Hessen. But that doesn't seem to be good enough. So the question is, how do these things all sort out? How poorly will the Social Democrats do? How much better will the AfD do? So even if ultimately the coalition itself doesn't change between the CDU and the Greens, exactly where parties fall could have some serious ramifications for the kinds of people running things in Germany going forward.
It's something we will obviously get to track for the next couple of days, and especially after the election, how is it that it plays out. Okay, so just a quick jump across the Atlantic. It seems that the congressional chaos in the US has completely sort of put out of joint European politics as well.
It's bonkers. U.S. politics maybe has always been bonkers since the country founding, and it's just beginning more and more bonker-ish as the years go by, as polarization, as money just continues to corrupt the heart of American democracy. But it's really what's happened in this past week is truly a bizarre spectacle. If we back up a few days, or back up a week, I guess by now, after the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, a Republican, which by standards these days is considered almost a moderate Republican, even though there's very little moderate about him, but he's just slightly less crazy than the really crazy Republicans further to his right. After he failed to get those people further to his right to agree to a budget deal, he then had to swing the other way and work with Democrats to avoid a government shutdown. He then got slammed by those further right Republicans for doing a deal with Democrats, and they vowed to unseat him, to get rid of him. Remember, Kevin McCarthy needed to go a historic number of rounds of voting earlier this year just to become Speaker of the House. These these extreme right Republicans led by like Matt Gaetz from Florida promised to unseat him. That's what he did, and that's what they ultimately did. But how did they do it? With Democratic support. So people like Matt Gaetz accusing Kevin McCarthy of acquiescing to the Democrats to avoid a shutdown, then allies himself or gets allied with Democrats themselves for getting rid of for getting rid of Kevin McCarthy, because almost no Republican actually voted to unseat Kevin McCarthy from the speakership position. It was a handful of extremist Republicans and then most of the Democrats who voted to have this unprecedented thing happen, which is not to replace the Speaker of the House, but just to leave the Speaker position vacant. So there is no Speaker of the House. There's no one leading Congress, which means no legislation can happen. Exactly. They've paralyzed themselves indefinitely because it's unclear when there will be a speaker, which means we're almost surely going to have a shutdown in November because the agreement that was passed last week is a stopgap measure to go 45 days. And tied to that is more funding into the new year for support, both economic and security assistance for Ukraine. And these things will probably not happen, which brings us back to Europe. And as you said, America being a reliable partner for the European Union and a leader in supporting Ukraine. And if the United States starts waffling in its support for Ukraine, you can very easily see support on the European side, which is cracking in its own ways. For support for Ukraine, especially as this war drags on with no end in sight, with no clarity if Ukraine, no matter how many weapons it gets, can really move the goalposts that much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the most remarkable things about this entire operation in Europe for me was that it seems that Europeans just never bloody learn. I mean, the US, this is not new, right? I mean, we have seen the US essentially sink into this complete political madness, as you pointed out, for quite a while. This one was particularly strange. I think that my reading is that the Democrats were actually very, very happy to see the Republican Party implode and show their complete madness. So they just went along with it. It's kind of a disgrace, right? There used to be the line, first the party. I mean, the Germans like this one. It's first the country, then the party. There is no such thing. I mean, it's the party at any cost. And now we have like groupuscules. But I think that, as we move forward and we're looking at next year's election, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that is happening under Biden and under a Democratic sort of somewhat allied or sympathetic administration. And Europeans are caught once again with their pants down, not knowing how to operate. And I think that this brings us back a bit to the question of strategic autonomy that they were discussing this week in Granada. It's not that, the problem is not simply that the US is unreliable at times of sort of radicalized governments like the Trump government with strange allegiances to Russia. I mean, it's never reliable. You're always kind of towing the line and trying to figure out. And nonetheless, I mean, you talk to Brussels and it's still kind of business as usual. Our friends, the Americans. To me, it was absolutely remarkable what happened this week. And I think that it's just the beginning of it, because if this thing goes farther and there is no Speaker of the House and the House remains in a state of essentially paralysis for the next 2 months, coming into the winter, mind you, the Ukrainian issue will become a very, very, very big one. Very big one.
Yeah. I mean, I think you talk about how the Europeans don't learn their lesson. That is true. I think especially Western Europe, Germany for sure.
For sure.
But especially Western Europe suffer from Stockholm syndrome. I mean, there is such an allegiance and a love for the United States given still in 2023, 80, 90 years later, for the World War II experience and then the post-war experience, the Marshall Plan, the bulwark against the Soviets, etc. And then post-Cold War, you bring the Eastern Europeans on, NATO expansion, U.S. support for spreading, market-driven democracy, I guess we can call it, into the East. You have a great love, a deep, deep, unshakable love for the United States as an idea, as an aspirational idea that the U.S., even on its best days, doesn't actually get anywhere close to realizing it. That you have this amnesia in Europe that maybe not the French, but certainly elsewhere in Europe, that the U.S. is this indispensable nation, this benevolent hegemon, this, it's a very paternalistic relationship. And I'm forgetting who said it once, but the U.S. is treated like a multilateral organization. It's not a multilateral organization. It is a country with its own interests and its own massive delinquencies, and a military hegemon and an empire in its own right. And the European Union, you're right, it doesn't learn its lessons, but why it doesn't learn its lessons is because it just keeps forgetting this. And this just paralyzes the EU from wanting to stray too far from its big brother, or I said paternalistic, its father, Uncle Sam, if I can mix my familial metaphors.
Those are very interesting mixed familial metaphors, actually. I mean, I think this is true. I think that nonetheless, the point that we made earlier today is actually one that still sticks, which is that there are a lot of mixed loyalties. So whereas you still have this sort of American, this sense of, just loyalty to an American idea of sort of, salvation and so on and so forth. There is also loyalty to an American idea of sort of radical market economies. There are many people around, especially in the eastern side, that would like nothing more than a return to Reaganomics. Obviously, completely forgetting what came after. I mean, forgetting the hangover of Reaganomics. And then you also have a lot of people around the block that are quite enamored with the craziest sort of, American evangelical Tea Party, truth to power kind of thing. So I think that what I see as being quite interesting is that there is an overlap of this sort of disaggregation of European political wills. I mean, which was sort of the consensus, which lasted many, many years, which maps over sort of the American breakdown kind of thing. Anyhow, so I think that this is almost all we have time for, but I think we should still talk for 2 minutes or 3 about what you're going to be looking at for the coming week.
Migration, right? One of the things that did or did not, or kind of sort of not come out of the Granada meeting was this migration pact. As I was writing the preview for our episode, I said the migration pact, Habemos migration pact, that they finally had agreement on it. And this is a perfect example of just the glacial movement of the EU. Even once there was agreement, there was not agreement. There was this big announcement that this momentous, landmark migration deal finally happened. And after that, the Poles and the Hungarians said, no, we haven't agreed to anything. So that's still going to be bubbling next week. I mean, more than just next week, but we're really in the center of it now, because migration is a major political issue, domestic political issue in various EU countries. I mean, it always has been, but there are elections happening now, and a major issue in real human terms, just because there's so many migrants, both legal and not, all kinds of different kinds of migrants coming into Europe right now. And you still have this Tunisia deal, which is also very funny. That's another thing I'm watching. Where surprise, surprise, the Tunisia deal. Well, the EU is looking for its money back, basically. So those are kind of the things that I'm going to be keeping an eye on.
It's actually really very interesting because the sort of the jump of the Hungarians and the Poles shows, I think, a very interesting break with the Italian far right, which is now in government. They had been sort of pretty close to each other for quite a while, and that's, I think, one of the blocs that could emerge in next year's election as a far-right, very powerful bloc in Europe. But this actually shows that the Poles and the Hungarians were not completely happy with that. So my
surprise.
Yes, indeed. So my story for next week is actually, as you announced in our menu for this week, are bed bugs. Paris is undergoing a massive epidemic, apparently, of bed bugs. Some claim that it's actually over. There is an overreaction and a bit of massive psychosis. But nonetheless, I think that once this kind of stories begin to spread, they do tend to have an impact, obviously, on tourist industry and every other political and economic indicator for the city. Paris is a very, very big hub of movement for Europe, so this could actually mean that we're going to be seeing a lot more of this for the next couple of months. Effect on already a pretty hard hit European economy. If there were a serious hit to the tourist industry, could be massive, could really be massive. So this very little bug could actually really wreak havoc on a lot of European economics and a lot of European politics going forward.
Yeah, it's crazy how, I mean, we know about this for New York City. New York City is
Right.
bed bugs. This is not a story, but for Paris, yeah, it's interesting, the economic fallout from something that can be seen as very silly.
Yes.
But yeah,
Well,
we'll definitely be watching that.
I think I would want to emphasize in that case that we're coming out of a pandemic where we had shutdowns. We are in the middle of a war. There is essentially some form or other of inflationary sort of blow up across the region. We have actually a massive influx of migration. If to this you add really a serious hit to tourism and all that comes out of tourism, we could be looking at something that, as it spreads through Europe, could become actually very serious. But let's take a look over the next week and see what we can say next week. It's been lovely.
I look forward to it.
Seeing you. We've done 46 minutes, 17 seconds. I think that this is perfectly acceptable for those of us that have other things to do.
Like eat cheese. I'm coming over for cheese as soon as I can.
And you are welcome anytime before we eat it.
Wonderful.
I will start another batch soon. So I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Take care.